Blood stained the snow crimson as Daniel stared into the amber eyes of the creature that would decide his fate. 3 winters earlier, those same eyes had watched him from a position of helplessness, the huge paw mangled in rusted metal. Now their roles were reversed. Daniel lay broken against unforgiving stone, his cries for help swallowed by the vastness of the wilderness. The massive grizzly towered over him, steam rising from its breath in the frigid air. Nature's ledger demands balance. A debt created must be honored. And bears, the elders whispered, never forget what they owe. Daniel Hayes had not always belonged to the forest. The tall pines and hidden valleys of North Creek National Forest had become his home only after he had grown tired of city noise and endless concrete. For 8 years now, he had worn the green and brown uniform of the Ranger Service with quiet pride. At 34, his face had weathered into something harder yet more peaceful than the anxious office worker he had once been. His small cabin sat at the edge of the Ranger District, farther from the visitor center than any of his colleagues preferred. From his porch, Daniel could watch deer picking their way through morning mist and hear wolves calling under star-filled skies. The seasons here were marked by the turning of leaves, the first frost, the return of migratory birds. Among the rangers, Daniel had earned a reputation for tracking skills that bordered on uncanny. The local hunters respected him, though they often rolled their eyes when he spoke about the balance of the forest. Daniel believed, with an almost spiritual certainty, that nature kept its own accounts. Take too much, and payment would eventually come due. His grandmother, part Cherokee, had told him similar stories as a child. She spoke of the ancient pact between humans and the natural world, an agreement of mutual respect now largely forgotten. When relocating even the most dangerous animals, he moved with gentle purpose, explaining his actions in low, calm tones as if the creatures might understand his intentions. What Daniel never expected was that his philosophy would be tested in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, or that the debt he created on a cold autumn morning would return to him when he stood closest to death. The October morning carried the first real bite of winter. Daniel had started his patrol before sunrise, checking the more remote sections of his territory. Poaching had increased as hunting season approached. The forest was quieter than usual. Birds had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to pause between the trees. The sound that broke the stillness was unlike anything Daniel had heard in his years as a ranger. Not quite a roar, not purely a cry of pain, but something that contained elements of both. It echoed through the trees with enough power to make the hair on his neck stand straight. Daniel followed the noise cautiously. As he crested a small rise, he saw it. The bear was enormous, even hunched over as it was. A male grizzly with fur the color of dark honey, one massive paw caught in the metal teeth of an illegal trap. The chain securing the trap had been stretched to its limit as the animal had fought for freedom. Blood matted the fur around the trap. The bear had been struggling for hours, perhaps all night. Its eyes, amber pools of intelligence and agony, fixed on Daniel as he appeared at the edge of the clearing. In that moment of mutual assessment, Daniel felt something pass between them. An understanding that what happened next would matter deeply to them both. Every ranger training manual advised the same protocol for a trapped bear. Call for backup. Sedate from a distance. Never approach alone. But backup was hours away, and Daniel could see that the bear was weakening. The animal had stopped struggling, watching him with an almost resigned awareness. Daniel made his decision knowing full well it might be his last. He approached slowly, speaking in low, even tones as he had done with injured animals countless times before. The bear watched, Its breathing labored but controlled. The trap was worse than he had feared. An old model with rusted springs and cruelly serrated edges, it had nearly severed the bear's paw. Working with methodical care despite his racing heart, Daniel prepared everything before making the final approach. He would have one chance. When the trap finally opened with a harsh metal screech, time seemed to freeze. The bear slowly withdrew its mangled paw, crimson drops speckling the fallen leaves. For 3 thundering heartbeats, they remained locked in place, man and bear, prey and predator roles suddenly unclear. Then the grizzly rose to its full height, nearly 9 feet of power and wild majesty. Daniel remained kneeling, making no move to run. Their eyes met one final time. Something passed between them. An acknowledgement. A debt created. The bear turned and limped away into the trees. At the edge of the clearing, it paused, looking back at Daniel with what he could only describe as deliberate intensity. Then it was gone, leaving only paw prints and the bloody trap as evidence of the encounter. Word of Daniel's encounter with the grizzly spread quickly through the ranger station. By the time he finished filing his report on the illegal trap, a small crowd had gathered in the break room, eager for details. Marcus Jenkins, the oldest ranger in the district, listened from the corner with narrowed eyes. When Daniel finished, the weathered man set down his coffee mug with deliberate slowness. "Now you've done it, Hayes," Marcus said, his voice carrying the gravel of 4 decades of wilderness work. "That bear owes you now, and bears always pay their debts. It's the way of things in these mountains." The room grew quiet. Marcus launched into a story about his grandfather, a trapper who had freed a wolf from a fallen tree back in the 1940s. 3 winters later, that same wolf had led him to shelter during the worst blizzard in county history. Lisa Chen, the wildlife biologist, rolled her eyes. "Let's not fill his head with superstition, Marcus. Daniel was lucky the bear was too weak to attack. Nothing mystical about it." But others joined in with their own tales. The local hunting guide who had spared a mother elk, only to have an elk herd mysteriously lead him to his lost son a year later. The Forest Service pilot who swore a falcon he had rehabilitated had warned him away from a failing bridge. Stories passed down through generations in these mountains, where the line between coincidence and cosmic balance blurred like morning mist among the trees. Winter arrived with heavy snowfall that transformed the forest into a frozen wonderland. Daniel found himself scanning the landscape for signs of the injured grizzly, though he knew the bear had likely denned for the season. The first unusual sign came in early spring. Daniel woke one morning to find strange marks in the muddy ground outside his cabin. Not quite footprints, more like something had been dragged across the earth. A week later, he found a cluster of early blackberries placed on his porch step. Their arrangement seemed deliberate, too perfectly centered on the wooden plank to have fallen naturally. The incidents continued. A freshly caught trout appeared one morning, pine cones arranged in an almost perfect circle near his woodpile. Each time, Daniel found large paw prints nearby, partially obscured as if intentionally brushed away. During his patrols, he began to feel watched. Not the threatening surveillance of a predator tracking prey, but a more benevolent presence. Sometimes he would catch a flash of movement among distant trees. Daniel began leaving his own offerings at the forest edge. An apple one day, a handful of blueberries the next. They always disappeared overnight. On a warm evening in late spring, Daniel sat on his porch watching fireflies rise from the meadow grass. In the gathering darkness stood the silhouette of the grizzly, larger than he remembered. The bear made no move toward him, simply watching from the tree line. Its injured paw was held slightly aloft, healed but clearly still tender. Their eyes met across the clearing, and Daniel felt the same connection he had experienced during the rescue. There was intelligence in that gaze, and something more. The bear was repaying a debt in the only ways it knew how. With protection. With gifts. With trust. October arrived again, marking a full year since the rescue. The mountains blazed with autumn color. Daniel took on extra patrols, helping to manage the seasonal influx of visitors. The day began with light rain that gradually intensified as Daniel hiked the remote northeastern ridge. The storm rolled in faster than forecast. Daniel radioed the station to report he was cutting his patrol short and heading back. Daniel chose a route along the ridge that would take him back to his truck most directly. The path narrowed as it wound around a steep section of mountainside. The earth beneath his boots had turned treacherously soft, saturated by hours of rainfall. The mountainside gave way without warning. One moment Daniel was walking, the next he was sliding in a churning mass of mud, rocks, and fallen trees. A final impact against something solid halted his descent. When his vision cleared, Daniel found himself trapped in a ravine, his left leg pinned beneath a fallen boulder. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. His pack had been torn away in the slide, leaving him with only what remained in his pockets. The radio was gone. So was his emergency GPS beacon. As afternoon faded toward evening, the temperature began to drop. The rain turned to sleet, then to the first snow of the season. Hypothermia would claim him long before morning if he remained exposed to the elements. Darkness fell completely. The snow increased in intensity, covering the ground around him in a thin white blanket. Daniel fought to stay awake, knowing that sleep in these conditions meant death. His thoughts grew sluggish as his core temperature dropped. The cold became an almost tangible presence, stealing his breath and dulling his senses. In the perfect darkness, he finally accepted that he would not survive until morning. The sound came first, a low, huffing breath that cut through the howling wind. Daniel forced his eyes open, certain he was hallucinating. Through the curtain of falling snow, a massive shape moved toward him with deliberate steps. The grizzly materialized like a spirit from the darkness. The bear approached without hesitation, its amber eyes fixed on him with unmistakable recognition. It was larger than Daniel remembered, its injured paw now fully healed, though it bore the scar of the trap. What happened next defied everything Daniel knew about wild animals. The grizzly began to dig around the boulder, powerful claws moving earth and stone with frightening efficiency. When the boulder shifted, Daniel cried out in pain. The bear immediately stopped, watching him with what appeared to be concern. After several minutes of careful digging, the bear positioned itself beside the boulder and pushed with its massive shoulder. The rock rolled away, freeing Daniel's crushed leg. Even free, he could not walk. The bear nudged him gently, then more insistently. Daniel realized with astonishment that it wanted him to climb onto its back. With no alternatives and death still circling, he grasped the thick fur and pulled himself across the broad shoulders of the animal. They traveled through the snowy night to a cave set deep in the mountainside. The temperature inside was notably warmer. The bear lowered itself gently, allowing Daniel to slide off onto a bed of dry leaves and pine needles. The interior showed signs of preparation. These were not random materials, but an intentionally created nest. Through the night, the bear remained close, its enormous body providing life-saving warmth. Twice, something approached the cave entrance. Each time, the grizzly rose with a warning rumble that sent the intruders scrambling away. At dawn, Daniel woke to find the bear gone. His leg throbbed relentlessly, but he was alive. the bear reappeared with freshly caught fish, still dripping from the stream. It placed the offering before Daniel, then retreated to the cave entrance, watching. For 3 days, this unlikely partnership continued. The bear brought food and water, stood guard against predators, and shared warmth during the cold nights. Daniel's strength gradually returned, though his injured leg remained useless. Daniel realized with growing clarity that the debt was being repaid in full. Life for life. Rescue for rescue. The wild creature was not acting on pure instinct, but with deliberate care. On the 5th morning, the bear became restless. It paced the cave entrance, looking back at Daniel with clear expectation. When he gathered his strength to stand on his makeshift crutch, the animal moved outside, waiting. It was time to leave the sanctuary. The journey was slow and painful. Daniel hobbled on his crutch, using the bear as support when the terrain grew difficult. They followed game trails that wound gradually downward toward the valley. By midday, Daniel began to recognize landmarks. They were approaching the main trail that circled the lake. Soon they would encounter people. The bear slowed its pace, growing more cautious with each step. The distant sound of voices carried through the trees. Daniel heard the distinctive crackle of Park Service radios. A search party. The bear stopped abruptly, turning to Daniel with an almost human hesitation. Their eyes met one final time, mutual understanding passing between them. The grizzly nudged him gently toward the voices, then backed away, watching. Daniel nodded his thanks. The bear held his gaze for a moment longer before turning and disappearing silently into the forest. Daniel called out, with what strength remained in his voice. Minutes later, he was surrounded by fellow rangers, their faces showing disbelief at finding him alive. They bombarded him with questions as they administered emergency first aid. Daniel told them everything, exactly as it had happened. About the bear he had rescued a year earlier, about how it had returned the favor, saving him from certain death. They exchanged glances over his head as they loaded him onto a stretcher. Later, at the hospital, a doctor mentioned that Daniel had been delirious from pain and exposure when found. His survival was attributed to extraordinary resilience and good fortune in finding natural shelter. Daniel spent 3 weeks in the hospital. His leg required 2 surgeries and a metal rod to repair the shattered bone. Throughout his recovery, Daniel requested a room with a window facing the mountains. During one of these contemplative moments, Marcus Jenkins entered his room carrying a stack of newspapers and a concerned expression. "Thought you should know," Marcus said, placing one of the papers on Daniel's lap. "Bear hunting season opens next week. Early this year, on account of increased grizzly activity near the east campgrounds." Daniel stared at the headline, his mouth going dry. "Special hunting tags issued for problem bears," the article announced. The Forest Service had approved 20 permits for the northeastern section of the forest. His section, the remote areas where his bear lived. "Your grizzly might be in trouble," Marcus continued. "The morning after they found you, a bear matching its description was spotted near Pine Ridge, too close to the campground for comfort. It's on the target list." Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. The bear had likely followed his rescue party, perhaps to ensure his safety. Now that decision had placed the animal in danger. The decision crystallized with perfect clarity. The bear had risked everything to save him. Now he owed the same debt in return. Against medical advice, Daniel checked himself out of the hospital 3 days later. Only Marcus suspected the truth, cornering Daniel as he loaded his truck with supplies. "You're going after that bear, aren't you?" Daniel didn't deny it. "I owe it my life." The old ranger studied him for a long moment before sighing. The Anishinaabe people believe that when an animal sacrifices itself to save a human, their spirits become intertwined. The debt never truly ends. He handed Daniel a small, worn compass. East Ridge has the fewest hunting blinds. Most hunters avoid it because of the rough terrain. Daniel established a base camp in the most remote corner of his territory. His injured leg made every movement an exercise in pain management. But Daniel pushed through, driven by the memory of amber eyes watching him through falling snow. He developed a system. Each morning, he would check for fresh hunting parties entering the area. When he located them, he would move ahead of their path, using his knowledge of the forest to make just enough noise to warn away any wildlife. For the first week, his strategy worked. None of the hunting parties reported grizzly sightings. Daniel occasionally found bear tracks that he recognized by the distinctive scar pattern on the right front paw. Then came the poachers. Daniel spotted their illegal camp one evening, hidden in a ravine outside the permitted hunting zones. 3 men with high-powered rifles and night vision equipment. They had found fresh bear sign and were setting up bait stations with rancid meat to lure bears into the open. He decided to report them, hiking to a ridge where his radio could reach the ranger station. As he was transmitting the coordinates, a twig snapped behind him. Daniel turned to find himself facing one of the poachers, rifle aimed at his chest. "Ranger Hayes," the man said, recognition flashing in his eyes. "Thought you were on medical leave." "You're outside the hunting zone with illegal bait. I've already called it in." The poacher's face hardened. "Then I guess we need to finish our business quickly. My partners found some mighty interesting tracks this morning. Biggest grizzly any of us have seen." As the man forced Daniel back toward their camp at gunpoint, clouds gathered overhead. At the poacher's camp, an argument erupted, voices rising with the wind as the storm approached. Daniel used their distraction to edge toward the trees. The first lightning strike illuminated the camp in stark white light. In that frozen moment, Daniel saw a massive shape at the edge of the clearing. Familiar amber eyes reflected the lightning's glow. The bear had come. As darkness reclaimed the forest, Daniel lunged for the tree line. A rifle shot cracked behind him, the bullet splintering bark inches from his head. His injured leg gave way, sending him sprawling on the rain-soaked ground. Through sheets of rain, he saw the poacher advancing, rifle raised for a killing shot. The roar that followed seemed to shake the very earth. The bear charged from the darkness, a force of nature more terrifying than the storm itself. The poacher fired wildly, his shots going wide as panic overtook aim. What happened next unfolded with dreamlike clarity. The bear could have killed the man easily. Instead, it reared to its full height, a wall of muscle and fur between Daniel and the poacher, and bellowed a warning that echoed through the canyon. The message was primal and unmistakable. "This human is under my protection." The poachers fled into the storm, abandoning their camp and equipment in their desperate escape. The bear lowered itself to all fours, approaching Daniel with the same gentle caution he had shown during their first encounter. They faced each other in the rain, man and bear, rescuer and rescued, protector and protected. The roles had shifted again, the debt passing back and forth between them like an eternal current. Daniel understood with sudden clarity that this cycle would never truly end. What had begun as a simple act of compassion had evolved into something profound. The bear moved closer, allowing Daniel to place a hand on its massive head. In that touch was acknowledgement of a bond that transcended the natural order. They had each saved the other not once now, but twice. Their fates were intertwined in ways that defied explanation. In the days that followed, Daniel used the abandoned poaching equipment as evidence to secure increased protection for the northeastern wilderness. The area was designated a wildlife sanctuary, closed to hunting permanently. Daniel never saw the bear again after that rainy night, though he occasionally found signs of its passing. A fish left on his porch step, distinctive tracks in fresh snow. As the years passed, he rose through the ranks of the Forest Service, using his influence to expand protected habitats. Sometimes, new rangers would hear stories about Daniel Hayes, the legendary ranger who communicated with bears, about how animals seemed to recognize him, to trust him in ways they trusted no other human. They would ask him if the stories were true. Daniel would simply smile and tell them what he had learned in the wilderness, that the forest remembers both kindness and cruelty, that debts created between living beings never truly disappear, but transform into connections that give life meaning, that the most powerful force in nature is not tooth or claw or human technology, but the sacred bond that forms when one life recognizes the value of another. On quiet evenings, Daniel still sits on his porch watching the tree line. Somewhere in the vast wilderness, the bear that shares his soul continues its solitary journey. Their debt has become something greater than obligation. It has become the story that defines them both. If you enjoyed this tale of unexpected connection and the profound bonds that can form between humans and wildlife, subscribe to our YouTube channel for more heartwarming stories that explore the magical relationships between people and animals. Join our community of animal lovers and conservationists to never miss another moving story about the wild hearts that touch our own.